Hello, everyone. Welcome to Connections with Shawnta Jackson. Connections is our opportunity as professionals to make the most out of professional networking, our careers, and business. And we do that by bringing on and having these live, unedited chats with like-minded individuals who not only inform and serve as a resource, but they also inspire us. And then I think this is also an opportunity for us to, sometimes we work in different fields and we don't realize that we are all connected, especially in my background. I am a public health professional. So in the world of public health, we have what we refer to as social determinants of health. And the social determinants of health are basically says that in addition to your physical and your mental health, where you live, your level of education, your access to resources or quality resources, including healthcare, education, your environment, not just your built environment, but also your social circle, the policies at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. All of these things impact your quality of life, and so sometimes that means that we're not working only with public health and healthcare professionals. We're also working with people in different fields. And a lot of times those folks in those different fields don't realize that we're all in the same game as far as those of us who are in health and human services. And which brings me to my next guest. His name is Munib Lohrasbi, and Munib is a decriminalization and human rights attorney. And he advocates for and he protects the rights of individuals with disabilities. And he'll tell us a little bit about his background, the issues concerning the criminalization of disabilities or people with disabilities. And then we'll tell you a little bit about how we know each other. We are streaming live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So please do enter your questions and comments in the chat box. Again, I'm Shawnta Jackson, and this is episode 23 of Connections with Shawnta Jackson. At this time, I will bring on my guest, Munib Lohrasbi. Hey, you. Hey, Munib, how are you?
Hi, Shawnta. I'm great. Thanks.
So what do you think backstage watching me doing the intro? How did I do?
You were great. Yeah, I think I need to get some more practice under my belt.
I put myself on the spot and I usually do good. But when I am, so for example, you and I, we work together on the People's Commission to Decriminalize Maryland. So folks watching, so Munib is a human rights attorney and also a decriminalization or a decrim attorney. And he works for an organization called Disability Rights Maryland. So in addition to Disability Rights Maryland, he is also the co-chair of the unhoused work group of the People's Commission to Decriminalize Maryland. And that's a project that I work on as a consultant, and also I'm also a member of the People's Commission. So I work very closely with Munib, and usually Munib, the policies that you all focus on failure to obey and fourth degree burglary. If you asked me to explain it, I don't know if I would do a good job at it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of the issues we look at, and you named a couple of examples there, are issues that criminalize folks just for living their day-to-day lives, right? Just walking down the street, trying to sit on a park bench, smoke a cigarette in a public area, things that we take for granted, right? But folks, for a variety of reasons, right, may be criminalized for that behavior, right? A lot of times the police get called when folks are experiencing behavioral health crises, right? And a lot of the times that's not really a criminal issue, right? It's again, a behavioral health issue. But police show up, police react in a way that they're trained to do. And a lot of the times those issues do wind up getting criminalized. Failure to obey a lawful order is an example of that, right? Where an officer gives an order and a person, whether that's because of cognition issues, whether it's because of a physical disability that impacts their accessibility and ability to follow and obey an order adequately to the satisfaction of an officer, those behaviors can get folks wrapped up in the legal system. And once you're in the system, issues tend to snowball, right? Whether there's a procedural issue around a court date, right? Whether you're having issue getting childcare, things like that can really start to snowball and impact every facet of your life. And that's something that we really try to recognize, address, and move to a better place.
So since we are on failure to obey a lawful order, could you tell us a little bit about what it is that you are working to achieve as it relates to that policy in the state of Maryland, or that criminal code in the state of Maryland?
Yeah. So I think I touched on it a bit there, right? But failure to obey a lawful order gives police officers authority to arrest someone for, again, failing to obey an order. It's right there in the title. But the problem with that is that it's very vague. It's very subjective, right? What is a lawful order? When does failure to obey rise to a level that's actionable, right? That the officer can initiate an arrest on. Those decisions are made by the arresting officer, right? So there's a real sort of checks and balances problem right there off the bat for us. And when you take into account, right, the sort of muscle memory that we have as a society to just dial 911 anytime there's any sort of an emergency, right, that becomes very concerning, right? Because officers show up to a scene that can often be chaotic. There can be a lot going on there. And disabilities can, be quite complicated, right? It's not something that you can just take a 1-day course on and be a master of, right? It takes a lot of training and recognition skills really to be able to serve as a first responder, we believe. So anyway, when an officer shows up and gives an order to maybe move, to do whatever it may be, right? I mean, it doesn't really serve a purpose to go through every possible order, right? But for whatever reason, failure to obey could result in an arrest. And that's not necessarily just in the context of someone's home, right? When we talk about the unhoused population here in Baltimore and Maryland and anywhere in the country, really, folks rely on just basic infrastructure outside in the public to survive, right? Whether that's to sleep, whether that's to use the bathroom, any sort of common human bodily functions, right, can be criminalized, right? Sleeping on a bench, an officer orders you to move, that could be criminalized, right? Using the bathroom in an alleyway or again, wherever you can, that's an action that can become criminalized. And that for us, again, is a real problem, right? Because my privilege allows me to, as you can see, I'm joining you all from this apartment today. I can use the bathroom in a private setting and it's no real issue, right? But someone who is just trying to survive out on the street doesn't have that luxury and privilege. So we're just trying to make sure that our criminal laws as a society reflect that and become a little bit more humane and empathetic, hopefully.
And so before we move on, so the request or the action for failure to obey, is it are you looking to amend that policy, or are you looking to repeal it, or are you recommending training? What is the final recommendation?
Well, we have a ton of options. I think through our work group with the homelessness, the unhoused work group with the People's Commission to Decriminalize Maryland, our recommendation is full repeal of the criminal statute that criminalizes failure to obey a lawful order. But there are other options as well. I do believe other states have taken action on this, and they've carved out exceptions to failure to obey. There are some states that have certain enumerated actions where an officer's order becomes actionable. So there are a host of reform options, right? But again, our goals are just to take away the vagueness and the subjectivity that officers currently have to criminalize this. And also, again, to just allow folks to live, breathe, survive out here in the same way that anyone else does have that luxury.
Thank you for that, and thank you for explaining that to myself and then also to the audience. Again, I bring on guests to inform and also inspire and just make us abreast and aware of different issues out there that actually affects all of us, right? And everyone, again, we are streaming live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Please do check in. Let us know where you're watching from, and please do enter your questions and comments in the chat box. We have In Your Ear Radio, Latoya checking in. She says, good morning and afternoon from Las Vegas. And then we also have Christy McGee. Christy is checking in from Monroe, Louisiana. Thanks for joining us today. And so Munib, let's go back to 2017. I read your bio, and you started out with your organization, Disability Rights Maryland, as a fellow with Open Society Institute Baltimore. And could you tell us a little bit about your role and the project that you were assigned to at that time?
Yeah. So for me, it all started for me in law school. I went to law school here in Baltimore at the University of Maryland, and they have a very robust and comprehensive clinical law program. And that actually allowed me to start working in correctional facilities my first year as a law student, which is a really rare and unique opportunity that the school was able to offer. My work with the law school was sort of on some post-conviction work. There was a case in Maryland 15 years ago, roughly, I think, called the Unger case, that found that some jury instructions that were given in criminal trials in the 60s and 70s in Maryland were actually unconstitutional. So that folks who had been sentenced with those jury instructions would then able to have their case revisited. And in a lot of cases, actually, folks were able to secure their releases. So as a law student, I wound up, doing a lot of visits to prisons and working with folks who are incarcerated directly for the first time, and started to learn about some of the issues that they're facing and a lot of the conditions inside these facilities. I think with other sorts of facilities, with schools, hospitals, whatever other facilities you can think of, there are folks walking in and out every day, right? There are members of the public with cell phones, have access to the internet. And there's, that sort of basic level of transparency that exists where if there's an issue, it gets reported, right? There's the videos, pictures, whatever. But in prison, that's just something that doesn't exist. That very basic fundamental level of transparency isn't there. So for me, at least, someone who had never visited a prison prior to 2017, didn't really have any close connections with anyone who was incarcerated prior to then, I was personally shocked, right? There were certain units in the facilities where folks weren't getting mattresses, right? Folks with severe mental health issues were not receiving services. Folks were having issues contacting their folks on the outside, whether by mail or by phone. Programming was severely limited, and particularly on substance abuse, right? So there might be folks inside who are locked up on a charge related to substance use, and part of their sentence from a judge, right, is to get substance abuse training. But then they go to a facility where that's simply not offered, right? Folks don't even have opportunities or access to resources that they need to turn their lives around and rehabilitate themselves into a functioning, contributing member of society in a way that they weren't when they were locked up initially. So the conditions for me were jarring. And it became a priority for me to address that sort of with my law degree and my skills as an attorney. And that's what I've tried to do first with my fellowship with OSI and now with Disability Rights Maryland in a different capacity.
Yes, and thanks for highlighting that and the fact that, some people will say, well, it's incarceration, and they can have a harsher view and say, well, what resources, do they need? Or some people think that there are people especially in state prisons or even at the local level, in jails, they sometimes think that, all of the resources are being provided to them, and basically that they have it good. And
Oh, right. Well, I mean, I think that what I would say to that, right, is that the incarceration itself is the consequence, right? We understand that there's a criminal law system and that folks, do get sentenced to terms in prison, right? But that doesn't strip you of any other of your human rights or your basic rights as an American citizen, right? The Eighth Amendment for cruel and unusual punishment, that doesn't mean that applies in prisons, right? So there are minimum standards that folks who are incarcerated are legally entitled to, right? Simply removing the person from the community, from their loved ones, from their support systems, from their work, school, whatever it may be, that's the punishment, right? And I think that we can have a separate conversation about whether or not that's appropriate. But once they are removed from population in that manner and their liberty is restricted in that manner, they still are entitled to basic services, right? Basic health care, basic hygienic living conditions, right? It could go on and on. But, if someone gets locked up for an issue and has a toothache, being denied dental care doesn't, that's not part of your sentence. So a big part of our job at Disability Rights Maryland is just to make sure that we're highlighting the humanity of folks, right? And I think I used the word empathy earlier, and that's something that we really strive for, right? That folks, that we're all human beings at the end of the day, and we need to strive for sort of a basic minimum standard of care and human dignity for us all.
And tell us a little bit about the report. You issued a public report, and it was based off of the death investigation of a young woman with mental health diagnoses. Could you tell us a little bit of just a little background about the case, and then the report, what were the findings or recommendations?
Thanks, Shawnta. Yeah. So I really got thrown into the fire. I started at Disability Rights Maryland with my fellowship in November 2017, November 1st. And by the end of November, we had gotten a report from the women's prison here in Maryland that a young woman in her 20s who had been locked up on a nonviolent offense, had serious mental health issues, and had unfortunately committed suicide in a restrictive housing unit. What I mean by restrictive housing is any sort of housing status that keeps folks in their cell for 22 hours or more per day. And there's a whole like tranche of research out there showing how that sort of housing status, restrictive housing, is harmful for anyone, period, right? You're in a tiny little cell the size of a closet, really. And often folks are in cell for 23, sometimes even up to 24 hours per day. But it's particularly harmful for folks who have pre-existing mental health diagnoses, is what we've seen and what the research shows. And this young woman, as I mentioned, who was locked up in a nonviolent offense, was sent to restrictive housing for a disciplinary issue she was having with a friend inside, repeatedly had requested mental health services while she was in that unit. Rounds were not done that day either, in an adequate fashion. They did rounds at about 7:30 in the morning when they did shift change. And what our report found is that there were no rounds done by security or staff until about 11 o'clock that morning, which is when the young woman was found hanging from her cell, hanging from a sheet in her cell, excuse me. And again, no mental health services had been provided while she was back there, despite repeated requests. So, as I said, this happened fairly early on in my fellowship, and went in with the intent to investigate the death as sort of an isolated incident. But what we found after interviewing as many of the other women on the tier as we could, and looking at conditions of the facility and other facilities around the state, we found that a lot of those issues were actually systemic and were not isolated incidents, unfortunately. So the work, as you can imagine, sort of took off from there, and we launched a facility-wide investigation at MCIW, the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women. And the report you mentioned, which we released in December 2018, as a result, highlighted our findings both in the death investigation and the overall facility review. And what we found, I think I mentioned a couple of our findings, right? Were just very jarring, though. That women in mental health units, again, were not given mattresses in some cases, blankets, pillows, that mental health services were being conducted cell side, meaning through the door. And cell doors are not like you see in the movies, like open air bars where, there's air between us and we can speak. It's actually thick steel doors, and the little window they have where your head might be is actually filled in with plexiglass. So in order to be heard, you really have to raise your voice and sort of a volume right below yelling to be able to have a conversation with folks. And there are other incarcerated folks on the tier. Obviously, there's going to be other staff on the tier, correctional officers, healthcare staff, whatever, right? And a lot of those times, those conversations don't wind up being confidential. And we had women who were in clear, desperate need of mental health services that told us that they actually refused services when offered because they were afraid of their peers hearing and using that information against them, or staff hearing that information and using that in a retaliatory fashion. So it's a very long, lengthy 30-page report. I would encourage folks to check out our website that I believe Shawnta very helpfully put up there at the bottom, and check out the report and and feel free to reach out with any questions. I do believe my email address is included in there too. There's a lot in there.
Yes, so for those of you who are not able to watch and you're listening, the website is disabilityrightsmd.org. That's disabilityrightsmd.org. And also you can connect with Munib Lohrasbi on LinkedIn as well. And thanks for sharing that background, Munib. And the fact that in addition to the access to the mental health services, I'm still thinking about the 22 hours or more being behind that steel door with that plexiglass. That's I can only imagine that. And so based off of, so the report is published and it's available on the website at disabilityrightsmd.org. But what next? How is your organization or your team, like, how is this report being utilized? Were there any improvements, any lawsuits, any releases? Like, what was the outcome?
Frankly, the outcome is not really where we need it to be. A lot of the conditions are still in place. I think that the facility and statewide, there have been some marginal changes to practices that have improved conditions a little bit. But bottom line is folks are still being placed in these restrictive housing units for weeks, months, some folks even years at a time, and they are not receiving adequate mental health services. So what do we do about that, right? I think the easiest, cleanest way for there to be changes is for the department itself, the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, to make changes administratively, right? Without being forced to on their own volition. As I said, this research is out there. We have shared that research with them. And there are several other states that have taken steps to reform the practice because of those studies, because of lawsuits, and for basic human decency, right? For whatever reasons you want to pick. I think Colorado has really stood out as the gold standard among those several states that have taken steps of reform. But the basic model is sort of to create a diversionary unit for folks with serious mental illness, who again are the most severely impacted and harmed by this practice. So when folks do have behavioral issues, there is an acknowledgement that folks, there are times when folks do need to be removed from general population. But instead of sort of throwing them in this dark hole, this pit where they don't get any services or human interaction, they're sent to this diversionary unit where they're getting just as much time out of cell as their peers in population, and they're getting greater access to mental health services, right? They generally have more staff, more funding, and folks are able to get more one-on-one time, more group services, and the results have been great, right? The pushback we get from the department a lot of the time is that restrictive housing is a necessary tool that they need to maintain safety and order in institutions. But as I said, this isn't like a novel theory that we have. We have data and evidence of so many other states that have made reform on this issue. And no state that's reformed this issue has seen an uptick in violent infractions. Violent infractions have either remained flat or decreased in every single jurisdiction that is reformed on restrictive housing. And I'm not a psychologist, right? I'm a lawyer, but I do think that we can sort of hypothesize that if you treat folks like human beings, then folks are going to start behaving in a more humane way as well, right? And if you treat folks like animals, then there are going to be more violent instances of folks just lashing out, right? Because they're left with no other options in a lot of cases. So just treating folks like human beings is really, I think, the underlying theme of our work here and what we're trying to get accomplished.
Yes, and also repealing failure to obey so that we can prevent folks from having engagements with law enforcement, or we can limit it, and so that they won't be arrested and put into the system in the first place. Right. And I'm going to go into the chat box. We have my mother watching, Belinda Norwood. She says, great show, very informative. And she and a few people are watching from Mississippi. And Christy McGee, she says, as a mental health specialist, I see an array of clients who are criminalized for behavioral health issues. Some clients have even died as a result of police officers not being properly trained in mental health.
That's awful. And I think that you hit the nail on the head there with that last comment, right? Is that I think that we're just asking police officers to do too much in a lot of instances, right? We do have a lot of people out there, social workers, mental health counselors, who've spent their whole lives training and specializing and communicating and addressing mental health issues. And I don't think it's a radical idea to say that those folks should be first responders in a lot of these behavioral health crisis situations.
Yes, and then also last week I interviewed someone and we talked about mental health and suicide prevention and awareness. And one of the issues that came up is the fact that there are not a lot, sometimes in some areas there are not enough mental health professionals available. There are not a lot of social workers available. So a lot of people are overworked. And so I think this is a wake-up call for opportunity for recruitment, just like I'm listening to C-SPAN and policies as it relates to transportation and supply and demand. And now there are trucking companies who are training high school students right out of high school to get their CDL license to help support the industry, right? And so I think for anyone who's watching, who's involved in career development, higher education, curricula development, or even policy or decision making, I think that we need to start to improve our pipeline for the mental health workforce and the social worker health force, and that includes increase in pay as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I think here in Baltimore again, and I'm just more familiar with just with this jurisdiction because of the work and where I live. But in Baltimore alone, annually, we're spending over $500 million on police budget, right? Routinely, officers are taking home six-figure salaries, and both in their base pay combined with overtime as well. I do think it makes sense, right, to sort of shift some of those resources again to folks who are trained and specialized in mental health communications and again services, right? So that cities and public jurisdictions are able to recruit the best of the best, right? We want folks who are at the top of the game and are able and equipped to make real differences in folks' lives.
Thanks. And checking in again, we have Reverend Edna Jenkins, and she's checking in from Prince George's County, Maryland, and she says protection of human rights is a human right. And again, Chrissy chiming in and saying awesome information. And then also Reverend Jenkins says treatment of mental disorders is a real need. Often people with mental health disorders are often treated as criminals. A friend with a PhD was arrested and taken to jail with no treatment.
Yeah, it's really horrible. I think that there's real strength in those stories, right? Because a lot of the time, I think when we confront folks with the state or the Department of Public Safety about these issues, too often they get brushed under the rug. So I think highlighting these real stories, makes it impossible for that to happen. So thank you so much for sharing that, and just keep giving those stories platforms and shining a light on that, please.
Yeah. And then we also have a comment from Dr. Arthur Webb, and he says, having worked in a federal penitentiary providing medical care, it is difficult to keep focused on providing care. You are a correctional officer first and a medical provider second. While I do understand that basic care is a right for all inmates, the environment and circumstance does not always permit this. And this is from his perspective as a medical provider.
I hear that, and we do get a lot of that. We definitely try and sit down with folks who are working inside and hear their concerns, and pay is a big part of that, but safety does come up as well. But I would respectfully disagree with the last part of that comment there, where medical and mental health protections in the law absolutely supersede, any other sort of local ordinances, right? The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, absolutely applies and takes precedent over local rules and state rules, right, which govern state facilities. So state and federal health and medical and mental health standards both absolutely apply, and we shouldn't forget that those absolutely that is the law.
Perfect. And thank you everyone for your comments and for joining. This is very engaging. Munib, this is a very timely and critical conversation. And for me, I just want to, I'm sorry, I got lost for words. I was reading the comments. And so for me, we do have some folks watching on LinkedIn as well. And the purpose of this show is not only for you to inspire and inform the guests, but also we are here to help you to make any connections that you would like to make. So are there any resources or asks or requests that you have as an attorney for Disability Rights Maryland, or as a member of the People's Commission? Do you have any resources, asks, or requests for us, for the audience?
I think that the main ask, again, is for folks if they have direct experience or know folks with direct experience, and would like to share their story and become part of this movement, right? This advocacy effort, then to please reach out. I'm not sure if there's a way to send out my email address to participants here, but would love to connect with anyone and chat about this further if anyone is interested, and sort of, again, to use those stories and real life experience to highlight the conditions out there and to inform the advocacy efforts when we talk to legislators, folks in the department, or even a judge down the road if it comes to that.
Okay. So I'll share one of your email addresses that I know by heart. unhoused@decrimmaryland.org. That's unhoused@decrimmaryland.org. And if you can chat it, type it in the chat box maybe, and then I can copy and paste. There we go. And then your other email address, give me a second, everyone. I'll put it on.
This is live, everyone.
Yes, this is live. Munib L@disabilityrightsmd.org. Munib L@disabilityrightsmd.org. And then also you can visit the website at disabilityrightsmd.org. And if you want to know more about the People's Commission to Decriminalize Maryland and how you can support the Unhoused Work Group and some of the other work groups and work of the People's Commission, you can visit decriminmaryland.org. That's decriminmaryland.org. Again, Munib Lohrasbi, thank you so much for joining us. Munib, everyone, again, he is a decriminalization attorney and a human rights attorney. And I am Shawnta Jackson, your host. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. My screen name is Shawnta Jackson, MPH. And if you want to know about my personal endeavors, you can visit shawntajackson.com. Please do subscribe to my mailing list. And if you are interested about my business and how we can work together in various spaces as it relates to health and human services, social justice, I can assist my company. I have associate consultants, and we assist with strategy, planning, implementation, evaluation, and promotion of socially conscious initiatives. And I hope I demonstrate that just through my endeavors, even just through this show, to showcase you some of our areas of expertise. But you can visit causeengagement.com. And we do have a few more comments. We have Gabriella. We have Gabby Sevilla, and she is the co-chair of the Unhoused Work Group, and she is also a human rights attorney and a decrim attorney. And she says this was an incredible show. Thank you, Gabby, for watching and for tuning in. And one final question, Munib, for Disability Rights Maryland, do you support persons under 18?
The organization does, and we have services for juveniles, but my work is focused in adult facilities. I'm our only attorney working on these issues, so we sort of have to pick and choose that way, but certainly something that I would push for if we had the capacity to do it.
Perfect. Everyone, thank you for joining. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Thanks.